At Manhattan's most luxurious restaurant, where glitz and glamour mask true natures, a deadly silence descends as a powerful customer decides to humiliate a waitress over a glass of water. Richard Collins believes money gives him control, but he doesn't know that. In the corner, another man is quietly observing. Ethan Whitmore, the real power holder, isn't there to enjoy the meal, but to see how people treat each other when they think no one important is watching. Ava Johnson's unwavering resilience in the face of bitter insults leads to a spectacular and unexpected reversal of fortune. What happens when the arrogant meet the one who truly holds the rules? Join us to find out. The most expensive restaurant in Manhattan went silent the moment a single voice decided someone didn't belong there. Crystal chandeliers reflected off polished marble tables as guests turned their heads toward a small service station near the kitchen. Ava Johnson stood there holding a tray steady, her expression calm even as the air around her grew heavier. "I didn't ask for cold water," Richard Collins said sharply, tapping the table as if the sound alone demanded obedience. A few nearby guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or pretend nothing was happening. Ava nodded politely, her voice measured, offering to replace the drink without hesitation or complaint. At the far corner of the room, Ethan Whitmore observed everything without revealing who he was to anyone present. He wasn't there to be seen, but to understand how people behaved when they believed no one important was watching. Richard leaned back, satisfied with the attention, continuing to speak as though Ava's presence was an inconvenience rather than a job. The manager hesitated near the host's stand, clearly aware of the tension but unwilling to escalate it. Ava moved quietly, replacing the glass, her steps controlled, refusing to let frustration show on her face. Ethan's eyes followed her, not the customer, noticing how she maintained dignity in a space that tested it constantly. Richard raised his voice again, insisting that service should match his expectations without exception. The room grew more still, conversations fading into background noise. Ava paused for a fraction of a second, then replied with calm professionalism, ensuring no emotion slipped through. Ethan slowly set down his glass, his attention sharpening as something about the situation began to shift. Richard gestured broadly, drawing attention from surrounding tables, as if the entire room existed for his satisfaction. A server nearby lowered their gaze, avoiding involvement, while the hum of the restaurant dimmed further. Ava remained composed, though every movement now carried the weight of being watched by strangers. Ethan noticed something most people missed. She wasn't reacting to humiliation, she was managing it. That difference made him study her more carefully, as if trying to understand a quiet equation no one else saw. Richard finally leaned forward, voice tightening as he questioned whether she was even suited for her role. The words hung in the air longer than expected, creating a discomfort no music could cover. Ava's answer remained steady, brief, and professional, refusing to escalate what she could not control. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something inside his observation had already begun to form a conclusion. And in that quiet observation, Ethan Whitmore began to realize that what was unfolding at this table was not about service at all, but about how people reveal who they truly are under pressure. The tension in the restaurant shifted from discomfort into something quieter and more dangerous, the kind of silence that makes every small sound feel amplified. Ava Johnson moved between tables with careful precision, carrying herself as though the weight of the room did not belong to her, even though every pair of eyes seemed to follow her steps. Richard Collins remained seated, but his presence expanded beyond his table, his voice occasionally cutting through the ambient music whenever he felt ignored or dissatisfied. At the far corner, Ethan Whitmore remained still, his attention no longer drifting but fixed, as if he was studying a pattern that repeated itself in different forms. He did not speak, did not intervene, and did not reveal any connection to the world of influence he carried outside these walls. Instead, he observed the way people adjusted themselves around perceived authority, and how quickly dignity could be tested in a public space. A manager approached Richard's table briefly, offering polite reassurances that everything would be addressed, but the conversation ended almost as quickly as it began, leaving behind more uncertainty than resolution. Ava returned to the service station, her hands steady as she prepared another order, though the rhythm of her work now carried a heavier emotional undertone. She was not distracted, but she was aware that mistakes were being anticipated from her rather than forgiven. Ethan noticed this shift clearly, the subtle change in how she paused before speaking, how she measured her words with greater caution than before. Richard leaned back again, speaking to his companion about standards and expectations, his tone implying that dissatisfaction was a form of control rather than communication. The surrounding tables grew quieter, conversations shrinking as curiosity replaced comfort. A guest near the window whispered something to another, but neither looked directly at the center of the disturbance, choosing instead the safety of observation without involvement. Ethan's gaze moved briefly to the manager, noting hesitation, then returned to Ava, who was now carefully balancing multiple orders without drawing attention to herself. There was something deliberate in her restraint, not submission but calculation, as if she understood that reacting emotionally would only deepen the imbalance around her. Richard called for attention again, this time pointing out a detail in his service experience that he framed as unacceptable, his words sharper than before, but still controlled. The room reacted in small ways, shifting posture, avoiding eye contact, pretending distance from the situation. Ethan finally leaned forward slightly, not enough to be noticed, but enough to signal a change in his internal assessment. He was no longer simply watching behavior. He was evaluating consequence. Ava placed a finished order on a tray and paused for a fraction of a second, her eyes briefly scanning the room before she continued forward. In that moment, Ethan recognized something most people missed entirely, that she was not breaking under pressure, she was absorbing it, and still maintaining direction. Richard's voice rose again, not in volume, but in certainty, as though repetition alone could redefine reality. The manager returned, standing closer this time, attempting to smooth the situation without confrontation, but the imbalance in the room remained unchanged. Ethan's expression remained neutral, but his focus had narrowed completely onto the interaction unfolding in front of him, as if waiting for a single detail that would reveal everything beneath the surface. The atmosphere inside the restaurant had begun to shift in a way that was no longer subtle, as if every conversation had been slowly pulled toward a single invisible center. Ava Johnson continued her work with disciplined focus, moving between tables with a calm that now felt less like routine and more like controlled endurance. Richard Collins had stopped pretending his frustration was private, and his voice now carried with deliberate clarity whenever he addressed staff, ensuring that nearby guests could not avoid hearing his dissatisfaction. The manager stood closer than before, hands clasped, offering repeated assurances that service standards would be maintained, yet each response seemed to dissolve the moment it was spoken. At the corner table, Ethan Whitmore remained composed, but his attention had become increasingly precise, no longer observing the general flow of behavior, but isolating specific moments that revealed intent rather than emotion. He noticed how Ava never rushed, even when pressure increased, how she refused to let urgency distort her professionalism, and how that restraint contrasted sharply with the environment around her. Richard leaned forward, speaking directly to the manager now, his tone shifting from complaint to demand, suggesting that consequences should follow what he described as repeated failure in service expectations. A small group of guests nearby exchanged glances, sensing that the situation was approaching a point where neutrality would no longer feel comfortable. Ava returned to the service station, briefly glancing at the order tickets, then adjusting her pace without hesitation, as though recalibrating herself to a system that was becoming increasingly unstable. Ethan observed this adjustment closely, recognizing that she was not reacting to chaos but reorganizing herself within it. Richard's companion remained silent, offering no support or disagreement, which only amplified the weight of his words in the space around them. The manager approached Ava briefly, speaking in a low voice meant to be discreet, but the tension in the exchange was visible even from a distance. Ava responded with calm clarity, her tone steady, showing no sign of resistance or fear, only acknowledgement of instruction. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in judgment but in analysis, as if he was tracing the structure of a situation that had stopped being about food service entirely. Richard suddenly raised his hand to summon attention again, this time addressing not just the staff, but the general environment of the restaurant, implying that standards reflected the identity of the establishment itself. The shift in framing changed the energy in the room, making every staff movement feel scrutinized, every silence feel heavier. Ava continued working, but now every step she took seemed to exist under an unspoken evaluation. Ethan finally shifted in his seat, a subtle movement that did not attract attention, but marked a change in his level of engagement. He was no longer a passive observer. He was now tracking escalation. Richard leaned back, speaking more calmly now, but with a firmness that suggested he believed authority had already been established in his favor. The manager nodded repeatedly, attempting to de-escalate without conceding ground, but the imbalance remained intact. Ava placed another order on a table, briefly meeting the guest's eyes, then continuing without pause, maintaining a level of composure that stood in quiet contrast to everything unfolding around her. Ethan noticed something else at that moment, a detail that most would have ignored, that Ava's attention was not scattered or shaken, but increasingly focused inward, as if she had already accepted the nature of what she was facing. Richard then made a final comment toward the manager, suggesting that accountability required immediate action, and the phrase lingered in the air longer than intended. The restaurant did not react outwardly, but something in its collective silence tightened, as though everyone understood that a decision point was approaching. Ethan's expression remained unchanged, but his presence in the room felt more defined, as if he was preparing to transition from observer to something else entirely, though no one yet understood what that would mean. The quiet inside the restaurant had become more than silence. It had turned into expectation, as if the entire room was holding its breath without knowing why. Ava Johnson continued moving through her responsibilities with steady control, but there was now a visible shift in how the space responded to her presence, as if every step she took was being measured against something unspoken. Richard Collins remained seated, yet his influence over the atmosphere had grown heavier, his occasional remarks no longer needing volume to create pressure, only timing. The manager stood slightly closer to his table now, as if proximity alone could reduce tension, but the imbalance in authority remained unchanged. At the far corner, Ethan Whitmore finally adjusted his posture again, this time with more intention, no longer blending into observation, but subtly aligning himself with the unfolding situation. He had seen enough patterns to recognize that escalation rarely announced itself directly. It arrived through repetition, through small concessions, through silence that gradually stopped being neutral. Ava paused briefly at the service station, reviewing an order ticket, her expression unchanged, yet her focus now deeper, as if she had begun to anticipate reactions before they occurred. Richard turned slightly toward the manager, speaking in a lower voice that still carried clearly enough to be heard by nearby tables, reiterating his dissatisfaction in a way that framed it as certainty rather than opinion. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, pretending to adjust their seats or check their phones, but their attention remained locked on the situation. Ethan observed how quickly discomfort spreads in controlled environments, how it travels without sound, altering behavior before anyone acknowledges it. Ava returned to the floor with a tray, her movements precise, her pace consistent, but now every interaction she made seemed filtered through an invisible tension. The manager attempted once more to redirect the conversation with Richard, offering reassurance that service adjustments would be made immediately, yet the response only seemed to reinforce Richard's expectation of compliance. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in frustration but in recognition of a familiar structure, where authority was assumed through persistence rather than legitimacy. Ava placed an order on a table, briefly acknowledging the guest with professional courtesy, then continued forward without hesitation, maintaining the same measured rhythm she had held from the beginning. Richard leaned back again, speaking now as if the matter had already reached its conclusion in his favor, his tone carrying the quiet confidence of someone used to being accommodated. The manager nodded repeatedly, but there was a visible delay between each response, as if agreement was being offered faster than it could be justified. Ethan noticed that delay, and in that delay he saw the real instability in the room, not in what was being said, but in what was being avoided. Ava stopped for a moment near the service corridor, inhaling slowly before returning to the floor, her composure unchanged, but her awareness sharpened, as though she had begun to understand the structure of the pressure surrounding her. Richard made another comment, this time not directed at a person, but at the standard of the establishment itself, expanding the issue beyond a single interaction into something larger and more absolute. The room reacted again in subtle ways, chairs shifting, glasses lifted unnecessarily, conversations disappearing entirely. Ethan finally leaned forward more noticeably, his attention no longer passive, but anchored to the exact center of escalation. He had recognized something critical forming, not a collapse, but a threshold, the point where silence could no longer contain what was building beneath it. Ava continued working through it all, her presence steady against an environment that was beginning to fracture in perception rather than action. And in that contrast, Ethan began to understand that what was about to happen would not be defined by volume, but by choice. The atmosphere inside the restaurant had reached a level where even the smallest movement felt intentional, as if the space itself had become aware of the tension building within it. Ava Johnson continued her work with quiet precision, but there was a subtle change in her rhythm now, a deeper awareness of how every interaction was being weighed by unseen expectations. Richard Collins remained in his seat, yet his influence no longer depended on volume, only certainty, as he continued to speak in a controlled tone that suggested the outcome was already decided in his favor. The manager stood closer than before, hands folded tightly, offering repeated assurances that lacked the strength to shift the direction of what was unfolding. At the far corner, Ethan Whitmore remained still, but his stillness was no longer passive. It had become focused, as though he was waiting for a specific point in time to reveal itself. He had seen enough patterns in human behavior to recognize that escalation often disguises itself as resolution before it fully emerges. Ava paused briefly near the service station, scanning the next order, her expression unchanged, yet her awareness clearly heightened, as if she had begun to understand the structure of the pressure surrounding her rather than just reacting to it. Richard turned slightly toward the manager again, speaking with calm authority that carried an underlying insistence, repeating his dissatisfaction in a way that transformed opinion into expectation. A few nearby guests shifted uncomfortably, their attention no longer casual but fixed, drawn into a situation they had not chosen but could not ignore. Ethan observed how quickly confidence in a room can erode when no one is willing to challenge the direction of authority, even when that authority is built on perception rather than truth. Ava moved back onto the floor, balancing another order, her steps measured and consistent, yet now every movement felt like it existed under silent evaluation. The manager attempted to bridge the gap again, offering reassurance to Richard while also signaling subtle support toward Ava, but the contradiction weakened both positions at once. Ethan noticed this fragmentation clearly, understanding that instability often comes not from conflict itself, but from hesitation in response to it. Richard leaned forward slightly, speaking again in a tone that suggested finality, framing the situation as something that required immediate correction rather than discussion. The surrounding tables grew quieter still, conversations fading entirely as awareness spread that something unresolved was approaching its limit. Ava placed an order carefully on a table, briefly meeting the guest's eyes with professional calm before continuing forward without pause, maintaining a discipline that now stood in contrast to everything around her. Ethan's focus narrowed further, his attention no longer distributed across the room, but anchored to the interaction between Ava, the manager, and Richard, as if the entire environment had condensed into that single axis. He noticed the subtle delay in responses, the way words were chosen more carefully, but still failed to stabilize the situation, and in that delay he recognized the absence of true authority. Ava stopped for a brief moment near the corridor again, her posture unchanged, but her presence now carried a quiet readiness, as if she had reached a point of internal clarity about what she could and could not control. Richard made another statement, this time more direct, implying that consequences should follow immediately if expectations were not met, and the room absorbed the words without interruption. Ethan slowly adjusted his position again, not enough to draw attention, but enough to signal that his threshold of observation had been reached. He was no longer simply witnessing behavior. He was measuring consequence, waiting for the exact moment where intention would override assumption. Ava continued forward, steady and composed, moving through an environment that was beginning to fracture not in noise, but in certainty. And in that fracture, Ethan understood that the next shift would not come from escalation, but from revelation. The air inside the restaurant had become so still that even the faint sound of glassware felt distant, as if the entire space was waiting for a single decision to define what came next. Ava Johnson continued her duties with steady control, but now every movement carried the weight of anticipation, as though the room itself was watching not just what she did, but what she might do under pressure. Richard Collins remained seated, yet his authority had expanded beyond conversation, settling into the atmosphere like an unchallenged assumption that required no further justification. The manager stood slightly closer to him than before, as if proximity could substitute for resolution, but the imbalance between them had already become structural rather than situational. At the far corner, Ethan Whitmore finally shifted in a more deliberate way, his posture no longer passive, his attention no longer observational in the traditional sense, but anchored to a precise understanding that the situation had reached its critical threshold. He recognized that what was unfolding was no longer about service or error, but about the moment when pressure forces truth into visibility. Ava paused briefly near the service station, reviewing an order that no longer seemed routine, her expression unchanged, yet her awareness fully engaged with the shifting dynamics around her. Richard turned slightly, addressing the manager again, but this time his tone carried finality, as if repetition alone had replaced the need for dialogue. He stated his dissatisfaction once more, not as complaint, but as conclusion, implying that the only acceptable outcome now was removal of what he considered the source of disruption. A few guests nearby stopped pretending not to listen, their attention openly fixed on the exchange, while others remained frozen in polite silence, unwilling to disrupt the fragile balance of the room. Ethan observed the subtle collapse of hesitation within the staff, the way uncertainty began to replace coordination, and he understood that systems fail not when conflict appears, but when response becomes delayed beyond clarity. Ava continued forward with another order, her steps steady, but now the space around her felt heavier, as though every direction carried invisible resistance. The manager approached her again, this time with a different posture, one that suggested instruction rather than conversation, and Ava listened without interruption, her expression composed, absorbing the information without visible reaction. Ethan's focus sharpened further, recognizing that the language of authority in the room was no longer distributed evenly, but concentrated through assumption rather than legitimacy. Richard leaned back slightly, speaking again in a lower tone, but the content of his words no longer mattered as much as the certainty behind them, a certainty that the situation would resolve in his favor without further challenge. The surrounding guests remained still, their discomfort now fully visible in their silence, as if the absence of reaction had become a form of participation. Ava stopped near the corridor for a moment, her gaze steady, her breathing controlled, and in that brief pause there was a clarity that suggested she understood exactly how far the situation had escalated without needing anyone to explain it. Ethan noticed that clarity immediately, recognizing it as the point where awareness becomes separation, where a person stops reacting emotionally and begins assessing reality without distortion. The manager returned once more to Richard's table, nodding repeatedly, and though no official decision was spoken aloud yet, the direction of the interaction had already shifted toward inevitability. Ava resumed her movement, but now her presence seemed to exist slightly apart from the surrounding tension, as if she had already reached acceptance of what was being constructed around her. Ethan slowly adjusted forward in his seat again, his attention now fully committed, no longer observing as a distant witness, but aligning himself with the unfolding consequence, understanding that what would happen next would no longer be shaped by discussion, but by the moment someone finally chose to break the silence. The silence inside the restaurant had shifted into something irreversible, no longer waiting for correction but for outcome, as if every person present understood that the next moment would define everything that had led up to it. Ava Johnson stood near the service corridor for a brief instant longer than usual, her posture steady, her expression controlled, but her awareness fully aligned with the tension that had been building around her since the beginning of the evening. Richard Collins remained seated, but his confidence had reached its peak, shaped by the assumption that authority had already aligned itself in his favor. The manager stood beside him, nodding again, his responses careful and measured, yet unable to restore balance to a situation that had already moved beyond his control. At the far corner, Ethan Whitmore finally rose from his seat in a calm, deliberate motion that drew no immediate attention but changed the entire structure of the room. His presence, previously unnoticed, now carried a weight that subtly altered the attention of those closest to him, even before they understood who he was. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he observed the final shape of the interaction, as if confirming a conclusion he had already reached internally. Ava resumed walking forward with another order, but her pace slowed slightly as she sensed a shift in the environment, not in aggression, but in certainty. Richard continued speaking to the manager, his tone now fully resolved, as if the matter had already been decided and only execution remained. The surrounding guests had stopped pretending entirely, their attention fixed openly on the unfolding moment, unable to detach from the tension that had reached its final stage. Ethan stepped forward from the corner, his movement calm but unmistakable, and for the first time, the room's awareness began to shift toward him. The manager noticed him first, pausing mid-sentence, uncertain how to interpret his presence. Richard glanced briefly in Ethan's direction, but did not immediately recognize the significance of his attention. Ava, still holding her tray, paused near the edge of the main dining area, sensing the change in focus without yet understanding its source. Ethan spoke at last, his voice controlled and steady, cutting through the atmosphere without raising its volume, asking a single question that reframed everything previously said. The question was not directed at emotion or opinion, but at process, at responsibility, at who had the authority to decide what had already been set in motion. The manager hesitated before responding, his confidence weakening as the structure he relied on began to feel insufficient under scrutiny. Richard attempted to reassert his position, but the certainty behind his words no longer held the same weight it had a few moments earlier. Ethan took one step closer, not toward confrontation, but toward clarity, and in doing so, the balance of perception in the room shifted decisively. Ava remained still, watching the exchange with quiet focus, no longer as someone inside the pressure, but as someone observing its resolution begin to form. Ethan finally turned his attention fully toward Richard, not with hostility, but with a level of composed authority that required no explanation. He stated calmly that decisions based on assumption rather than fact could not proceed without accountability, and the words settled into the room like a final correction. The manager lowered his gaze, no longer attempting to mediate. Richard's confidence faltered for the first time, not through resistance, but through recognition that the structure supporting his position was no longer stable. Ava exhaled slowly, her posture unchanged but her presence now lighter, as if the weight surrounding her had begun to dissolve. Ethan turned slightly toward her, acknowledging her without words, as if confirming what he had already understood from the beginning. The room did not erupt or collapse. Instead, it simply realigned, as truth replaced assumption in a quiet but undeniable shift. And in that final moment, the situation did not end with force or conflict, but with the clear recognition that authority without fairness could no longer stand unchallenged. The room did not return to normal after the words were spoken. Instead, it entered a quieter version of reality where everyone understood that what had just happened could not be undone or ignored. Ava Johnson remained still for a moment near the edge of the dining area, her tray lowered slightly, her posture steady but no longer under the same invisible weight that had defined the earlier atmosphere. Richard Collins sat frozen in place, his earlier confidence no longer supported by the room around him, which had subtly shifted away from alignment with him and toward a new center of attention. The manager stood between them and Ethan Whitmore, but now his presence felt less like mediation and more like hesitation made visible. Ethan remained composed, his stance calm, his expression unchanged, but the clarity in his presence had already redefined the structure of authority in the room. No one spoke immediately, as if the space itself required time to adjust to what had been revealed. Ava slowly resumed her movement, placing the order she was holding onto the nearest table, her hands steady, her professionalism intact, but now without the burden of expectation that had previously followed her every step. Ethan turned slightly, his attention briefly resting on her, not as an observer of behavior anymore, but as someone acknowledging what had already been understood without words. Richard attempted to speak again, but his voice lacked the earlier certainty, and the words did not carry beyond his table in the same way they had before. The guests who had been watching now looked away intermittently, as if the intensity that had once drawn them in had been replaced by discomfort with what remained unresolved in themselves rather than the room. The manager finally exhaled, lowering his hands, no longer attempting to control the direction of the interaction, recognizing that control had already shifted elsewhere. Ethan took another step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, but deliberate enough to ensure that every remaining voice in the room understood the shift was final. He spoke again more quietly this time, stating that dignity in any environment was not optional, and that silence in the face of imbalance was still participation in it. The words did not escalate tension. Instead, they dissolved what was left of it, leaving behind a strange stillness that felt more stable than what had existed before. Ava looked briefly toward Ethan, her expression unchanged but her awareness clear, as if acknowledging that something fundamental about the situation had been recognized and corrected. Richard no longer attempted to assert control over the conversation, his silence now carrying more weight than his earlier demands. The manager stepped back slightly, signaling without words that the situation would no longer proceed in the direction it had been heading. Ethan did not pursue further confrontation. Instead, he allowed the moment to settle into completion, as if the purpose of his presence had already been fulfilled. Ava continued her work, but now her movements felt uninterrupted, no longer shaped by external pressure, only by the rhythm of her responsibility. The restaurant slowly resumed its ambient sound, not in relief, but in recalibration, as people returned to their meals with quieter awareness of what had occurred. Ethan returned to a neutral stance, no longer the center of attention, but still fundamentally altering the space simply by having been present within it. Richard remained seated, no longer speaking, his earlier certainty replaced by a stillness that reflected the reversal of expectations he had assumed would remain unchallenged. Ava moved through the room once more, and this time no one interrupted her, no one questioned her, and no one imposed judgment on her presence. The environment had not become louder or more chaotic. It had become corrected, as if balance had quietly returned to a place that had momentarily lost it. And in that corrected silence, the understanding remained that authority, when separated from fairness, does not endure when someone is willing to name what others choose to ignore. The restaurant had settled into a fragile kind of calm, the kind that does not come from resolution, but from the exhaustion of tension that can no longer sustain itself. Ava Johnson moved through the dining floor with steady professionalism, no longer carrying the invisible pressure that had defined earlier moments, yet still maintaining the same discipline in every step she took. Richard Collins remained seated, quieter now, his presence reduced not by removal, but by the absence of reinforcement from the environment around him. The manager continued his duties with cautious normality, as if attempting to rebuild structure through routine actions, though the shift in balance was already permanent. Ethan Whitmore stood near the edge of the room for a moment longer, observing not the conflict anymore, but the aftermath of perception changing shape in real time. He understood that most situations do not end when words are spoken, but when people collectively accept a new version of reality. Ava placed another completed order on a table, her expression calm, her movement unbroken, and for the first time that evening, her presence was no longer defined by resistance, but by simple continuity. Ethan slowly turned his attention toward her again, this time without analysis or evaluation, but with recognition of something more fundamental, a clarity about human value that required no further interpretation. Richard looked down at his table, no longer engaging with the room, as if the energy that had once reinforced his certainty had completely dissipated. The guests who had been watching earlier now returned fully to their meals, though their behavior carried subtle restraint, as if they had collectively learned something they could not easily articulate. The manager approached Ava briefly, speaking in a measured tone, but the interaction now reflected routine coordination rather than correction or pressure, and Ava responded with calm acknowledgement before continuing her work. Ethan took one final step forward, then stopped, allowing the room to exist without his influence, as if confirming that intervention had already fulfilled its purpose. He looked once more across the dining space, noting how quickly environments recalibrate when truth is introduced without aggression but with certainty. Ava paused for a brief second near the service station, not from uncertainty, but from completion of task, and in that pause there was a quiet sense of stability that had not been present earlier. Ethan's gaze softened slightly, not in sentiment, but in understanding, as he recognized that real authority does not demand recognition. It reveals imbalance and allows correction to occur naturally. Richard remained silent, no longer attempting to reclaim what had already dissolved, his earlier presence now reduced to a memory of expectation that did not materialize as intended. The restaurant's ambient sound returned fully, but without the sharp edges it had carried before, replaced instead by ordinary rhythm that felt newly grounded. Ava continued forward, serving the next table with the same steady professionalism she had maintained throughout, but now without distortion from external pressure. Ethan finally turned away from the center of the room, no longer needed within its dynamic, and began to walk toward the exit with calm composure. As he left, nothing dramatic marked his departure, yet the space subtly confirmed that something irreversible had already taken place. Ava, still moving through her responsibilities, carried herself with unchanged dignity, now uninterrupted by scrutiny or imbalance. And in the quiet restoration of normalcy that followed, the unspoken understanding remained that the value of a person is never defined by the volume of judgment around them, but by the steadiness with which they remain whole when that judgment is finally removed. Today's story is a heartwarming reminder that status doesn't define a person's worth. It's how we treat each other under pressure that reveals who we are. Ava stood firm on her product's value, and Ethan chose not to remain silent before things went wrong. If you believe that kindness and fairness should always be upheld, join Unheard Truths America. Like if you support Ethan Whitmore's actions. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring hidden truths and valuable life lessons. Comment below. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a similar situation to Ava's? What would you do if you were Ethan in that situation? Thank you for watching. Always uphold your values, no matter what the world around you can't solve. See you in the next video.